So hi everybody, my name is Pelle Pedersen and you're watching DoLand's webinar series on sustainable investing. Today I'm joined by Simon Bond, Director of Investment and Portfolio Management under Columbia Threadneedle, an American asset manager with almost $500 billion under management. Simon, it's a true pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's just a bit of lag there, but we'll manage. And today's topic is social impact, an investment theme you can choose to invest in with DoLand. But sometimes, at least for me, it can be challenging to communicate what social impact is and how you can invest in it. And for that reason, we have invited Simon, one of the most renowned experts within social investing. But first, Simon, could you sort of please just introduce Columbia Threadneedle and yourself and what social impact investing really is?
Yes, thank you very much. My interest in social investing, I've been in the markets for 34 years, and 29 years ago, the first entity I analysed was a social housing provider. So it goes back all that way, where I found that actually investment can have a very good side, providing social housing, etc. And when we launched the UK Social Bond Fund nearly 7 years ago, all of that frustration about what the bond market could do and how we could provide for society through financial markets came flooding out. And indeed, we now have a European Social Bond Fund with a track record of 3.5 years. And it's become a very, very big part of all of our lives and a very, very big emphasis for Columbia Threadneedle.
What is the great answer to the sort of the question why social impact investing is relevant?
Well, it's a difficult subject with all these different acronyms and things. And I think if I just put up the next slide, what I view this as is boiling down to two things, ESG and impact, and they're different. And we've taken this from PGGM, the Dutch pension fund, and they describe it as ESG, doing the thing right. It's within the control of management, the sorts of practices that management have about managing their business. Whereas impact is doing the right thing. That's the effect of the business on wider society, wider communities, wider economies. So if you just bear that in mind, when I go through and talk about these things, of course we do both. We're looking for companies that are doing the thing right, but even more importantly, we're looking for the impact of doing the right thing.
And can you maybe just elaborate a bit, Simon, on what ESG is?
Yeah, ESG is again, another of these acronyms, environmental, social and governance factors. That's what ESG stands for.
Yeah, and it's something that's been dominating the market, the financial markets for the last couple of years, which is basically a sustainability screening you use when you analyze companies. And impact, how does that differ?
Well, impact is the effect of a business on the wider community. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the externalities that you would find in an economics textbook, and we're trying to internalize those externalities. So rather than a company just having the effect of doing its business on its profit and loss account, it's also the actions of that company and the effect that that has on wider economies, wider communities, and indeed on society as a whole. So it's a much more encompassing way of looking at things and taking a holistic approach, basically.
And maybe if you could go to the sort of introduction to you and to Columbia Threadneedle and your social impact bond, and give us some background on who you guys are and how you see the spectrum of responsible investment.
Yes, obviously at Columbia Threadneedle we have a large number of portfolios. And broadly speaking, those portfolios that are focused on responsible investment fit into certain categories. But the traditional non-ESG approach would be just taking a financial view. On the slide I've put in front of you, that's on the left-hand side. And I'll just work across this spectrum of responsible investment. So you go from traditional non-ESG to integrating ESG, environmental, social and governance factors into your research process, through to excluding the worst cases, tobacco, alcohol, those sorts of things, and then across to the best in class. So you're looking for the best within an industry at these factors. The impact side is on the, what I like to call the leading edge on the right-hand side. It's the point within thematic outcomes. But we could actually go further than this spectrum. We could go into what you would call philanthropic, altruistic, even charitable endeavor. We stop at the point where it ceases to be investment, at the point where you start to sacrifice financial returns. And so what we are doing with impact investment is we are giving you the return that you should expect for the risk that you're taking. There is no sacrifice of that return. So it's not philanthropic, it's not altruistic, it's not charitable, it's investment.
I think it's important to dwell on that note, Simon, because at least from my perspective and from DoLand's perspective, we're seeing too many asset managers being very defensive when they talk about returns on impact and on ESG integration, where a lot of them they start to say you don't compromise on risk and return by integrating sustainability. But I think it's much more relevant to explain why you're basically investing in what the world needs.
Yes, indeed. The challenges of society itself, and indeed the challenges of economies themselves, are pretty great at the moment, and no more so than this year, when, of course, the COVID-19 crisis has really focused people's attention on what is a social crisis, a health crisis, and it's led to other crises, employment crises, etc. And indeed, education has been affected. These are all social concepts, but what up until now has been the main focus has been environmental. So there are a lot more elements within the challenges for society than just environmental. However, having said that, if we get the environment wrong, it's going to cause some of the worst social problems that I can imagine. So you can't actually separate the two, environmental and social. Indeed, if we get it right, if we get to net zero by 2050, it's going to come at a cost. And we need to make sure that that cost is not borne by those in society least able to afford it. So there's environmental about the social, and there's social about the environmental.
And I think, Simon, that's a good segue to maybe go to the next slide on how you at Columbia Threadneedle approaches social impact investing.
So what we're doing with this slide here is really the ethos behind what we're doing, the belief statements behind what we're doing. We believe in positive inclusion, not negative exclusion. So we're actively looking for investments that are also going to do good for society. In order to prove that, we have an evidence-based analytical approach. We have analysts that are actually analysing the use of proceeds and the effect of that money on society. And the difficulty is when you move from environmental to social, how do you measure it? We will take any measure from wherever we can find it, and we will build it into our analysis as evidence. However, sometimes that evidence is not immediately apparent, it's not published. And so we have to actually go to the issuing entity of the bonds and engage with them and ask them awkward questions in order to prove what they're doing is going to be good for society. And the point is, with a bond, that's the point where a borrower will come to the market, issue a bond, borrow the money, and then spend that money in society. That's where the impact occurs. If you buy a bond in the secondary market, we talk about an outcome. But also the bond market, you have access to management. It's not like an equity holder. You don't own a piece of the company, but you have the best access to management when they want something. What do they want? They tend to want money. So the new issue process, the point where you have the best access to management and the best impact. Now, the way we go about actually doing that, first and foremost, we have to take the financials as our main criteria still. It has to be the most important factor, because if you think about it, if in extremis, if a company goes bust, it's neither going to deliver the financial return you want, nor is it going to deliver the impact. So once we've satisfied ourselves along those lines, we're then looking at the ESG factors, the internal control of management, their employment practices, their governance, their environmental credentials, but with a particular focus on controversies, because that's when they're under pressure. And we want to see that under pressure, they're doing the right thing. And so we want to see how they're reacting to those controversies to give us a window into the culture of management and confidence that they're going to react in the same way going forward. So we need to satisfy ourselves of that before we then move on to the impact assessment. And that's where we drill down into the individual bonds themselves and exactly where the money is going and what good that money being spent in society is going to do. And so it's a three-stage process.
Yeah, and could you maybe, Simon, for the ones out there not familiar with the bond market and how that works, potentially give us an example of how a social bond is issued by, for instance, a company or a city, and how that money is being spent on both providing an attractive financial return and actually doing good in society?
Yes, of course. Well, a bond, it's no more than a tradable loan. Whatever it's described in your economics textbooks, that's what it is. It's just a loan that can be traded. And so it's borrowing. A company will borrow the money, and of course they will borrow the money to do something with. If we took an example of, let's say, a university, it's clearly an educational outcome. They'll be spending the money to the benefit of education. However, they may be funding buildings, infrastructure, assets, if you like, capital projects, etc. We can physically see where the money is going, and we can look at the area that it's going into. Is it a more deprived area? Is it tackling deprivation? Is it environmentally sensitive in terms of the types of buildings, for instance, that they're building at the time? Or it could be an energy company. We've got a great example in Denmark of what used to be Danish oil and natural gas, Dong Energy, that's now Ørsted. And that transition that we've seen, they would have borrowed money in order to make that capital investment, in order to build the wind farms, to build the sustainable energy that we now see that company representing. And that's what we're able to access through investing in the bond market.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And touching upon Ørsted, I think it's we're discussing social impact bonds and investing in that space. I know you also have a bit of green bonds, or a lot of green bonds in the portfolio. Could you maybe touch upon how a green bond that is financing green projects like renewable energy or energy efficiency, how that actually also has a lot of social impact in the society, and why that is hence eligible for you guys to invest in?
Yes. The key thing about a green bond, it's just a normal corporate bond, but it has a specific use of proceeds. And the specific use of proceeds is towards predefined projects that benefit the environment. In addition to that, what we buy are green bonds with social benefits. So where we can see the money going to a use of proceeds, I'll use an example. Let's say the Belgian government issued a green bond. And we've just heard today that following a campaign, the UK government may be issuing a green bond. But there are social benefits even to that. With the Belgian government green bond, 70% of the money went to transport infrastructure, Infrabel, SNCB, etc. That's providing for a much more efficient, carbon efficient way of travelling in that particular country. It also is creating jobs. Additional transport infrastructure is good for the economy, is good for the environment, but it's also good for society. It connects people. And so we see the social benefits, even with a bond that is tangibly towards environmental projects. And that particular specific use of proceeds is very important for us to be able to see where the money is going and analyse how much good that particular money is going to do for society.
Yeah, and we'll touch upon Ørsted just a bit later, and maybe digging into the specific product. I know how important social impact is for you and for Columbia Threadneedle, which is one of the reasons we advise our investors to invest in your fund when they select social impact. Could you maybe touch upon how you guys are ensuring you have a deep focus on social impact in your investment process?
We've got some specific slides that would really back that up. But I think the first thing to say is, what do we mean by social? I've just put a slide up here. These are the 7 areas of social outcome that we are specifically targeting. And each and every bond in the portfolio, each and every bond in the universe of available bonds for us to buy, must deliver for society in at least one of these 7 areas of social outcome. So that's the first thing. Is it social? Is it delivering for society? And in the case of, we still kept the old name, Dong Energy, at the bottom of the next slide here, because it's been a transition from Danish oil and natural gas to now what we see with Ørsted, which is much more sustainable energy and biomass, etc. So we've been on that journey with them and with that particular company. But particularly, I want to focus on this. This is what we call our Barometer Slide. This is the depth of detail, the bottom-up fundamental analysis that the responsible investment analysts go into in order to come up with a social intensity score. I'll just highlight a couple of things in here. We're actually measuring the additionality the additional services, the additional infrastructure that's being provided by a bond. So if it's not actually providing anything new, it will get a low score. If it's providing new services, new infrastructure, you'll get a higher score. We also, if you look at the fourth one down of these stage scores, we're focusing on, is it tackling deprivation? Is it tackling an area of society that is more deprived? It might be the young, it might be the old, perhaps geographically a more deprived area of the country, or refugees or the disabled. Is it tackling deprivation? And then at the bottom, we're also focused on the quality of the impact reporting, i.e. what we will say to companies when they say, why should I go to the time, the effort, the cost of providing all this information to prove all these scores, is if you give me better information, if you give me better proof, if you give me better evidence, you will get a better score. And then we go through things like, where does it sit on a hierarchy of needs? Is it social to a greater or lesser degree? How much of it is in Europe? This is the European Social Bond Fund, so that becomes important. Are there additional benefits? Is it also providing for the environment? Is it also providing another of those 7 areas of social outcome, like jobs, etc.? We'll go into quite some detail, backed up by evidence, and you'll see if you add all of the numbers on the right-hand side, the maximum score that you could get in social intensity would be 31. And so the little barometer on the right-hand side goes up to 31, and then we will split those ratings down, as you can see in front of you. But the key thing is that this becomes something that is consistent, it's comparable across different social outcomes and across time, and it's evidence-based, it's based on measurement. And that is the sort of rigor that we go into in order to analyse the use of proceeds of each and every bond in the portfolio.
So you can certainly say that you have a very granular approach to social impact investing, and ensuring once you invest, it's on the basis of a deep analysis of the outcome of these specific bonds.
That's precisely right. Yes, exactly. We also, though, have minimum standards. So there are certain things that we wouldn't invest in, and I've just got a slide here just to show those, because there are certain elements to this that we want to have minimum standards. So if it's producing alcohol, if it's producing tobacco, if it's nuclear, fossil fuel, we want minimum standards of the company itself. So we also have those kind of elements, but most of what we're doing is looking at producing a social intensity score that is as high as we can possibly get it. And overall, a portfolio, therefore, that delivers in terms of that social intensity score. And indeed, we set targets to try and improve that social intensity score, to try and prove what we're delivering for society is getting better over time.
Yeah, I think it could be great, Simon, maybe to dig into how you actually measure this, because our discussion here is still like at a very theoretical level on social impact and how you approach it. So I think it would be great if you could dwell on how you actually measure the impact you talk about when you say social impact.
Yeah. In terms of the measurement, what we're looking for are individual scores that would be part of that barometer slide that we see in front of us here. So if I just take an example here with a very well-known Danish company, particularly in the UK, because of how much the spending goes in wind farms around the coast of Britain particularly. What we're looking for is we're looking to provide for one of those 7 areas of social outcome. And in this case, you can see that the proof that we're looking for is in that reporting, that use of proceeds that you can see here. And so we're looking at where is the money going, and we're looking at exactly how much good that is likely to do. In this case, in the case of Ørsted, that would be for the provision of sustainable energy. And that is something that is really, really important, both for the environment, but also for society. When we look at new technology, when we're looking at sustainable energy, that's what will fund the future growth of economies in a more carbon efficient way. And that's what will get us to net zero by 2050. However, it's also providing an awful lot of jobs. An awful lot of investment itself is going into the wind farms that we see in the North Sea, etc. So there are also some social benefits, some additional benefits. And if we go back to the slide here and just quickly run down with that as an example, The use of proceeds of that bond is specifically to build new things, to build new wind farms. It's providing for energy, it's providing for clean energy, and it's focused entirely in Europe. As you run your eye down these things here, is it tackling deprivation? Well, this is a concept that is universal. So clean energy and cheaper energy is something that is very essential for human life. It keeps the lights on, the power, the ability to do your homework, to cook your food, etc. Is focusing on the needs of society. And also the quality of reporting, particularly from Ørsted's green bond, is very, very good. We know exactly where the money is going, and we know exactly the type of investment that's coming out in terms of the use of those proceeds.
Yeah, and it says on the slide on Ørsted, it says that the use of proceeds, meaning what they can invest in, that they are ring-fenced. Can you just maybe explain what ring-fenced means?
Yes. The great thing about a green bond or a sustainability bond or a social bond is that it's a specific use of proceeds. So we will lend management the money through the bond, but we will ensure that they can only spend the money that we give them in certain predefined projects. In this case, you can see some of those eligible projects that are on this slide here. That's the key thing for a green bond. These are environmental projects. For a social bond, they would be social projects. And for a sustainability bond, they would be both social and environmental. But we ensure that management can only spend the money that we give them on those predefined projects, and that they also report back on the disbursement of that money on an annual basis.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really important here to communicate to the viewers and in the investors on the DoLand platform that have decided to invest in this fund. That is, all of these projects are completely ring-fenced. Simon and his team, they know where the money is being used, also to ensure that they can actually report back to you guys on the impact derived by your investments. But if you could maybe go ahead, Simon, and dig into a bit more about the measurement. I know you have a few slides on that.
Yeah, the other thing that we do is we actually look for the intentionality of a bond itself. Now, we have the other concept of pure play companies, and that would include things like universities, that their very business is doing good, providing education, for instance. But we're looking for the intentionality of the bond, and we categorize it. This is something that's been used by the Inter-America Development Bank in categorizing their projects, and we've adopted that. So a category A impact investment is something that's intended to do good for society. The example here is the Council of Europe Development Bank's social bond, and they're responding to a refugee crisis. Indeed, that's how they were constituted in the first place. Now in Europe, we have another refugee crisis that's been clouded a little bit by COVID-19, but it's tangibly looking to do good for a deprived community within the society. The second is an investment that may not have intended to have had an impact, a social impact, but nevertheless, the use of proceeds means that we can identify that it is going to have an impact. And that's the example I used before of the Belgium Green Bond. It's an investment with impact, and we categorize that as B. Everything else is a category C. So that's more development finance, or it could be something that's outside of Europe. So the example there is the African Development Bank is an extremely good bond for tackling deprivation in Africa, but it's outside of Europe. And so we categorize that as category C. And so that's the way that we would categorize intentionality. And then, of course, we look at the level of intensity. So African Development Bank has a very, very high score because it's focused on additional things within mainly sub-Saharan Africa in order to tackle deprivation and provide funding for African villages, etc. And that's how we would score it there. However, when we've done all of these categorizations and social intensity scores for each bond, we also have the ability to be able to prove what we're doing in that term. So when I've said to you that because we score the social intensity of each and every bond, we can aggregate the intensity of each and every bond, and we can show you the improvement in that social intensity score over time on the top left of this particular chart. This is something that we are held to task on. This is something that we need to be able to measure to prove to investors that we're delivering on the promises that we're making. But that's just the mean average. What about the best? And what about the worst within the portfolio? So the bottom left, these are the intentionally impact investments, the category A impact investments. And indeed, we have a social advisory panel that sets us minimum standards and actually is improving those standards. So they are pushing us to make sure that we deliver on social alpha, that it's not just the market that delivers, that it's our intention to actually target those better investments. And you can see at the bottom left, the proportion of the fund in impact investments. However, the recognition that also we need some of the lower social outcomes on the bottom right-hand side is limited. So up to 25% of the portfolio, we can put in the lower social outcomes for two reasons. One, it's still doing good for society. Even the lower social investments are still net positive for society. But two, we need those lower social outcomes. We need some leeway, if you like, in order to provide the diversification, in order to provide the return and to provide the liquidity, so that this portfolio we can construct as something that looks and feels and smells and performs like a typical corporate bond fund. And so these are some areas that we can be held to task on. And in fact, we have a social advisory panel that specifically meets every quarter to keep my feet to the fire, as the Americans call it, to hold me to task on delivering on the promises we make to investors for the benefit of society.
Yeah, and could you just maybe ask Simon, who's a part of that panel?
Yeah, so the panel itself is on this slide here. We have a social partner. And that social partner has been chosen. We have one for the UK fund, we have one for the European fund. And the purpose is to touch the process in three distinct ways. This social advisory panel is one of those ways. And that is to review, advise and monitor everything that I do. And you can see that our social partner, Inco, have 3 appointees to this panel. And so they will dominate the panel. Only 2 from the portfolio manager, only 2 from Columbia Threadneedle, myself and Ian Richards, and then 2 independent appointees. We're having a meeting next week, and the 2 independent appointees bring their own particular flavour, their own particular expertise and indeed reputation. But you can see that the people that know about social are the people that dominate this particular social advisory panel. And so they would be reviewing everything we do, monitoring everything that we do, but also it gives me access to somebody to get advice as to, is this social? Is this conforming to one of those 7 areas of social outcome? Because I don't want to go to this particular panel with a problem. So I will seek their advice intra-meeting if there's any contention about whether this bond is delivering for society.
And I guess they are sort of an integral part of how you guys report back to the investors. And I know you've adopted sustainable development goals. Sorry.
Yes.
Process. So maybe touch on that and explore how the fund delivers on those 17 targets.
Yeah. So the sustainable development goals were developed by the United Nations. Probably not for this purpose, actually, but we really like the UN SDGs because we will map each and every one of our bonds to one of those 17 SDGs. In fact, we don't map to the 17 SDGs. There are actually 169 targets that underlie the 17 SDGs, which are much, much more specific and much more relevant for developed markets. And if you do it properly and you map to those underlying targets, you can produce a coverage here that you see in front of you that you can rely on. And this becomes, if you like, a common language for the industry. So you can compare through these SDGs your equity portfolio, your fixed income portfolio, property, direct lending, whatever it may be, using this common language. So whilst we're still targeting 7 areas of social outcome, we will also map each and every bond to its primary SDG. Now you'll see that some of them we've been unable to cover because the bond market doesn't provide an opportunity to do that. One of them is life below the water, SDG 14. However, I have to report to you, new news, that Nordic Investment Bank have issued a blue bond. You've heard about green bonds, you've heard about social bonds, sustainability bond. Blue bond is tackling particularly responses to problems in the Baltic Sea and to provide solutions and money that goes towards cleaning up and providing that biodiversity within the Baltic Sea. So now, or at least next time that I present to you, I hopefully will be able to show you SDG 14 with a percentage figure in there, because we bought that blue bond, and we bought that blue bond because it delivers in terms of life below the water.
That's great news, Simon, because it is also something, a theme we would like to add to the DoLand platform. But if we don't have any funds out there where they, at a meaningful level, can explain how they're supporting SDG number 14, we simply can't put the fund on the platform.
Yeah, it's something we hope to encourage more of, actually, because we've already seen Seychelles, first of all, issued a blue bond. Nordic Investment Bank have now issued a blue bond. There are lots of different companies, lots of different entities that potentially could do good for life below the water that we want to see issuing a bond so that we can fund that kind of work.
Yeah, and if I'm an investor in this fund, let's say through DoLand or other places, how do I see at a tangible level what kind of impact you guys are delivering? Because it can be, when we're talking about ESG, we also recorded a podcast last week. And I think the financial community, us included, we have to really consider how we make this particular impact tangible, communicated in a way that is something all of us can understand. So how have you approached that from Columbia Threadneedle?
Just as we find it very important that companies report to us, we also equally find it very important to be able to report to our investors on the good that we're doing. And this again is another way that our social partner will also contribute towards the process itself. We produce on an annual basis. In fact, we don't produce. Our social partner, independent of us, produces an impact report on the fund. Here's an example from last year's impact report. We're at the second draft stage of this year's impact report. We will take a position for the fund on the 30th of June of each year. Halfway through is our cutoff point. And then for the rest of the year will be the time that our social partner has to deliver the impact report. Now, last year, you can see, because we measure how much is focused on deprivation, because we measure how much of the bonds in the fund is focused on additionality, additional things for society, we can produce a figure to show that 29% of the fund focuses on deprivation, 36% of the fund focuses on additionality. Indeed, there's a crossover of 17%, which delivers on both. We can also even look at within the green bonds that we're buying, even though we're buying them for social benefits, we can also take an analysis of those green bonds and see how they're delivering for society. So you can see the number of coal-fired power station emissions that we're saving each year by investing in those green bonds. To me, a carbon number doesn't mean a lot. When you're talking about a number of coal-fired power station emissions on an annual basis, that means something more. But particularly on the left-hand side, you can see some of the real figures that underlie all of this. 188,000 social houses. That's something tangible, that's something real, that's something measurable. And you can work your way down all of those particular elements, including jobs, including focus on those sorts of statistics that people are concerned about, right down to microloans to women at the bottom. So we're focusing on gender here as being something that's important for society to encompass that gender bias that we see and try and do something about it to approach that particular problem for society. And you can also see the SDG alignment in a different form because, again, we like to have that within all of our reporting. So when our social partner reports to our investors on how I've done managing the fund and how Columbia Threadneedle have done on analysing each of the investments that we make, you can see that common language of SDGs across the bottom of the report there. It's a much, much more deep report than this. This is just the highlights. It will be produced hopefully within the next month, and that will go out to investors.
Yeah, and that report will equally be available on the DoLand platform. We also shared the report for 2019 with people that have signed up for the rating list and received really, really good feedback, because we need to make these figures, we need to give them some life. What does this mean when we talk about social impact? So putting those reports in front of people and explaining why this just makes sense from a financial and a social perspective is really, really important if we are to engage people into social impact investing. And I think that's a great segue into the next slide on performance, because I onboarded an investor last week where we talked about the different themes you can select on the DoLand platform, whether it's renewable energy or women empowerment or something in that ballpark. And then we also touch upon social impact. And in the beginning, she didn't select that fund because I think she questioned whether or not that fund is attractive from a financial perspective. And I think it's also from my side, how do we communicate that even though it's called social impact, and for some people, and again, I completely understand that, it sounds like, that we are closer to philanthropy than actual investing. So could you maybe dig into the performance of the fund and also explain how attractive it is, let's say from a risk return perspective? Because of course it's a fixed income product. It's not listed equity, meaning that you won't see the same returns as you've, for instance, seen with the renewable energy fund we have on the DoLand platform, that I think it's up maybe like 70% this year, but it's also much riskier compared to this social impact fund. So could you maybe elaborate on that, Simon?
Yeah, of course. I've gone too far. Let's start with the figures. Here are the figures. This is a corporate bond fund. It's a corporate bond risk. And this business that we're in is very, very simple. It's all about risk and reward. You should have the appropriate reward for the risk that you're taking. So if you take a higher risk, you should expect a higher return. Now, the returns that we've seen through the life of the fund are in front of you there. We also compare ourselves to a conventional index in a way that fund managers tend to prove whether they are outperforming or underperforming the index over time. And the reason that we compare ourselves to a conventional index, which is based on the Euro non-sovereign index, the reason we do that is because we absolutely reject the idea you need to sacrifice financial return. And so we have to compare ourselves to a conventional normal corporate bond index that does include alcohol and tobacco and nuclear and arms and all those sorts of things that we wouldn't invest in. But we want to be able to show that you can still deliver the same kinds of returns even without investing in those particular areas. And indeed, you should get the return for the risk that you're taking. You take a corporate bond risk, you should get a corporate bond return. In addition to that, we are active managers. We are actively looking to turn this portfolio over and to focus on those new issues that will deliver for society. And we think you should be repaid for the cost of that active management. And so what we're looking to do is outperform to the extent of offsetting the extra cost of active management. So the cost of active management, defined as the difference between passive management and active management, we think you should also get that. And you've seen that since inception, we've actually done a little bit better than that. The annual management costs, without the expenses that are on top of that, have been covered in their entirety since inception. So we've proved that you don't need to sacrifice financial return in order to deliver for society. And we show that in terms of both our financial return and indeed the social alpha that I've shown before. But the key thing here is that we think you can have both. We talk about this concept in England of having your cake and eating it, of having both at the same time. And that's what I've spent the last nearly 7 years proving, that you don't have to sacrifice financial returns and you can do it. Now, having said that, the risk that you're taking is a corporate bond risk. And as you quite rightly said, a corporate bond risk is much, much lower than an equity risk. The volatility of those returns is far, far lower with bonds. And so that's the sort of return that you're seeing from the corporate bond market itself. It's not 70%, it's not 7%, it's more like 2 to 3%, but that's because the risk is so much lower. We are investing in what we call investment grade risk, investment grade type companies. These are pretty secure, fundamentally institutions that are delivering, and the risk of default is quite low.
Yeah, and I think it's really, really important again to communicate that the risk is much lower compared to, let's say, a renewable energy fund. Could you maybe give an example of why that risk is lower if we use your example with, let's say, the African Development Bank?
Yeah, something like the African Development Bank, these are called supranationals. They're owned by, in terms of their equity, they're owned by national governments. lots of national governments. You may have heard of the World Bank that was set up after the Bretton Woods conference after the Second World War. That's a supranational. So they tend to be focused on the World Bank, focused on the world. African Development Bank is focused on Africa. The European Investment Bank, we've all heard of, that's another supranational. And they're owned by governments and they're supported by governments. And so the risk of exposure to a government is much, much lower even than a company, even than a corporate bond. And so those kinds of entities, they're very liquid bonds, they're doing an awful lot of good. And in the case of African Development Bank, in a very deprived part of the world, but actually the risk is very, very low. That is in fact a AAA. That's the best type of quality of exposure that you can get in the bond market.
Yeah, and from our side, we of course also see this this fund as a way to create some stability in the portfolios for the investors that make use of DoLand. So that's very important to say. So we can actually make a diversified and robust long-term investment for the each individual investor with different pieces from a renewable energy fund, a women empowerment fund, and a social impact fund. In order to create a portfolio that's, as I mentioned, stable and robust going forward. But time flies, Simon. If we go to the last slide on sort of the future, how do you see the market for social impact bond developing? We are now in a global pandemic with COVID-19. How has that sort of affected the market, and where do we go from here?
Now, the future, this is where you're going to have to stop me because I've got an awful lot to say. But the key thing about this slide is it's already out of date because there has been a tremendous response, particularly from the bond market. The speed of response to this current crisis that we're in has been remarkable. The numbers on this page, if I just mention 530% increase in labelled social bonds this year, that's now over 600%. That means that there is 600% more issuance this year to date than there has been in the previous year. In fact, it's over twice the size of every single social bond that's ever been issued before this year. Tremendous volume of response, but also speed of response. So we were getting these issues coming to the market in very early April. Now, if you think about when lockdowns occurred, when the whole of this COVID crisis really started to bite, that was probably towards the end of March. The speed of response from the bond market has been absolutely remarkable. So it's delivered in volume, it's delivered in size, and it's also delivered in the types of bonds. So we now have specifically COVID response bonds. These are social bonds that are delivering for the challenges that have been provided by the COVID-19 crisis. And indeed, the types of transition bonds that we've seen this year. SNAM have issued a transition bond for utility in Italy and Cadent in the UK. This is to transition from what we currently have as a carbon emitting energy production into something much more sustainable, and follows really the path that we saw from Dong Energy moving to Ørsted. It's to try and encourage that kind of movement. We've also seen national governments issuing green bonds, and indeed in the case of Luxembourg, sustainability bonds. So targeting projects that are not only environmental, but also now social. Indeed, today we are expecting an announcement from the Chancellor in the UK to announce the UK issuing these. But we've also seen Sweden and Germany this year. So even the figure for green bonds, that's out of date as well, because we've seen national governments issuing. We've seen banks issuing social bonds that are targeting particularly SME lending in more deprived areas of the countries that they're funding. So there's been a tremendous proliferation of the type of issuance in the bond market, which is no more than these institutions just borrowing money and then spending it to the benefit of society and also to provide the financial returns. So what you're facing with these bonds is no more than you would do with a normal corporate bond fund. It's the same profit and loss account. It's the same balance sheet. What you're ensuring, though, is that the use of proceeds, the money that you're giving these institutions, is being used to the benefit of society as well. That's the real crux of the matter. And so the future could be anything that we like. What's happened as a result of COVID-19 is people have broadened their focus. Where people last year were much more focused on the environment in exclusion of everything else, because of the health crisis, because of an education crisis, an employment crisis that's resulted from this, people's perspective on what is important for society has widened from just the environment to other things as well. And so the bond market has responded to that. The kind of attention that I've seen coming for the sorts of funds that I'm running here has been massively increased through what is a tremendous crisis for society. We've seen that actually, I can say that actually the market itself, the bond market that's delivering these kinds of investment opportunities, is focusing much, much more on society as well as the financial return. So part of the solution is what we're talking about. It's only part of the solution. It's only what financial markets can deliver, but it's part of the solution, not part of the problem. Financial markets, particularly through the financial crisis, were seen as part of the problem. I think now we can start to slowly bring people's attention round to the fact that using markets, using the incentive base, using these types of new technology can actually be part of the solution to the ills of society going forward.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see that the Corona crisis has really increased the focus on social factors, not only within fixed income, but generally within the financial markets, and hopefully we'll be able to communicate much better why investing is so important in order to shape a more sustainable future.
Precisely.
And with that, Simon, we're going to end our first webinar on sustainable investing. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your insights on how you can both create impact and attractive financial returns.
That's my pleasure. I hope it was interesting for everyone.
I'm sure it was. And if any of you guys out there have any topics you would like us to discuss, don't hesitate to reach out at Pelle at DoLand.dk. We'll make sure to send you a copy of the impact report from Columbia Threadneedle. And with that, see you in the next one. Bye-bye.